Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you, Sarah. Before I start, I just want to, maybe everyone can join me in giving a digital round of applause, because this whole webinar has just been extremely interesting and useful to me. Even when I haven't been able to make it, I've been looking at the talks on YouTube, and I'm happy to be, part of the growing community around philosophy of psychiatry. So yeah, and thanks for sticking around also until June, those of you who were able to make it to see me. All right. So today I'm going to start, if you've seen me give a talk before, how I usually start, which is in sort of situating the discussion around an example, because I think it's useful to sort of sort out different domains or maybe interests or worries that people have when they think about psychiatric phenomena, which is a really sort of broad kind of thing. So let's take Allie. Allie makes an appointment with a therapist because she's been feeling melancholy and unmotivated, and this has interfered with her work and social life. So what does it mean for her that she seeks a diagnosis? So we can take Allie to be your typical help seeker in psychiatry. She might approach a psychiatric practitioner. She might approach a clinical social worker, or maybe a teacher at her school, or somebody who she sees as in a position of authority, or somebody who's able to help her. And she might be looking for sort of different things when it comes to what counts as like a satisfying explanation to her, something that explains what's going on. And the way I like to sort of lay this out is this way. So when explaining to Allie what's going on with her condition, we might report normative facts about her, right? So we might tell her that she's sick, or conversely deny that she's sick and say that she's in fact healthy. So these would be evaluative claims that might help Allie figure out what she should do next, if she is obligated to take steps to be better, or what have you. Another thing that we might do is report descriptive facts about her, maybe cognitive psychology, or her underlying psychological nature. And this might help her understand so maybe the causal basis of how things got to be so bad, and how particular interventions might help her change things for the better. And then the third domain is facts about diagnostic kinds, or the sort of category terms that are familiar not just from diagnostic manuals like the DSM, but literature and television and news media and things like this. Labels like bipolar and obsessive compulsive and depression have become colloquial terms that users of psychiatric medicine are able to use and throw around and understand. And they also have become identity labels in a way that might be really helpful. So Allie might think, I didn't really know how I fit in, but now I understand I have depression, and I can relate to people with this condition in this way. And she might seek out forums or something like that. So one reason why I like to sort of separate these domains is because it's never quite clear which kinds of claims a particular author might be making. Many times we're sort of going across these domains. So in saying that somebody is depressed, we might be making both an evaluative claim and a descriptive claim. And what I want to do is sort of be careful about which domain that I'm talking about, just so that we can have a clearer conversation. And in fact, in today's talk, what I want to focus on is that sort of first domain, the evaluative facts. So I want to think about when and how we think we're justified to make claims like Allie is sick, or Allie ought to change her behaviors in such a way as to be better, or some part of Allie's brain or Allie's mind is broken and should be fixed, or should be this other way. And in particular, I think, this is salient because part of what we want to do when we're doing good clinical reasoning is think about what the standards are, what the evaluative standards are for making psychiatric diagnoses. I think because we think of psychiatry as a science a lot of times, but sometimes like the exciting action takes place in trying to situate psychiatry with cognitive neurosciences and, figure out how new facts about the brain that we're discovering fit with some other things that we're doing in psychiatry already. And I'm geeked about that too, but for now, I want to focus on the evaluative bit, in as much as these things come apart. So the big question that I want to ask is, what's the place of the normative in the natural world? In particular, how do we get evaluative claims to apply to human minds and brains such that we can make claims like this person is sick or this person is healthy? And to focus in, I'm going to look at, the wonderful world of analytic philosophy, fantastical realm, and in particular, Peter Railton's paper, Moral Realism from 1984. So in this paper, what Railton is trying to do is provide an analysis of ethics, right, that permits us to see how, quote, the central evaluative functions of this domain can be carried out within existing empirical theories, which is just to say that he wants to know how ethics can be done well if you intend to be a naturalist. And he comes up with this term he calls naturalized norms, or sometimes he calls them criterial norms. And they are explanations which are supposed to rely on statistical typicality as a natural, objective, or scientifically grounded source of normativity. And I think, despite the fact that Railton here is concerned with ethical and moral claims, some similar things are going on when we're thinking about evaluative domains like prudential good for well-being, this kind of thing. At least for those of us who are trying to be naturalists, we're looking at the way things usually are to try and figure out the way that they should be. And so what I'm going to do is look at how Railton understands naturalized norms by looking at a particular case that he gives, an architectural example that he calls the snow and roofs case. And sort of give a critique that I think essentially the take-home message is something like, I agree that it is our shared goals which fix the normative in the natural world, but that we can't sort of draw the types of lessons that he thinks we can draw, and that other authors that have relied on this style of norms think we can draw, especially in the domain of mental health. So maybe a sort of quip way, short way of saying that is to say that, you can look at naturalized norms to make evaluative claims in psychiatry, but it's a cheap coin. And that this sort of confusion actually might lie at the center of some crucial debates about disability and disease that we've been sort of talking about all semester. So let's just jump in. All right. So here is Railton's account. The first step, like I said, he begins with the everyday thought that we have goals or interests that we pursue. And he's thinking about these things very broadly. They can be very fleeting, like your desire for a cup of coffee, or they can be long-term goals, like your desire to have a fulfilling career, right? And we think, these goals can be explained by appealing to facts about ourselves. And these facts about ourselves are broadly our underlying values, right? So he says, we can say that X is non-morally good for A if and only if it would satisfy a value of A. And that's, analytic philosophers speak for saying coffee is good for me if it satisfies one of my underlying values. And that could be something really thin, like maybe I value coffee for its own sake, or, maybe I value being a really productive philosopher, and the caffeine is a step on the way to being able to focus and write and speak. Starting from there, he says, then the norms that we use emerge from those goals and values. So you fix the goal that you have, supposing that it's agreed upon, and you're able to sort of draw explanations about failures based on what the goal is. So, for example, take a roof which needs to bear a load of snow during a winter snowstorm, right? When the roof collapses, we can give an if-then explanation as to why it collapsed. Something like, well, you know, if the roof is to withstand that amount of snow, that load or weight, then it has to have rafters with such and such descriptive features. For instance, it ought to have had 2x8s rather than 2x6s as part of the beams. And then that if then just gets subtly switched into an ought, right? Because we have the agreed upon goal of the roof staying up, we all agree that it's better when roofs do that. And we have this sort of if then, we can make a claim like, well, the roof ought to have had, or maybe ought to have rafters of 2x8 in width or something like that. So notice here that there are sort of three important components going on. There are two sets of descriptive facts in the case. So there are facts about the way that the rafters are, the descriptive facts about the architecture of the roof, as well as facts about the context or environment that that roof is supposed to be operating in. So if it's Canada and you're going to get a large winter storm, then that's going to be slightly different than if you're in Florida and you need to withstand wind rather than snow or something like that. So we have the facts about the roof and the facts about the snow, as well as that goal that we agreed upon previously, namely that, you know, it's better that roofs stand up. And when you put these three things together, that's how the naturalized norms emerge, right? In this case, in the snow and roofs case, it's an architectural convention and one that's easy to agree on. But as long as you can, it's supposed to be that these naturalized norms can emerge. The way that he sort of elaborates this is by saying, look, because the goal is contextually fixed, in this case by architectural convention, and because there are more or less definite answers to the question of how to meet it, and moreover because the explanatum phenomenon is the result of a process that selects against instances that do not attain the goal, the ought containing account contains that explanatory information, which is to say, you know, we, by trial and error, figured out the way that the roof should be. We built a bunch of these roofs, some of them fell, and so they turned out to be not good designs, and we sort of narrowed in on the good design for the roof that is to bear this load of snow. It's the way it ought to be. And then he says, explanations of the ought form, where you switch from the if then to the sort of ought style of explanation, are just those naturalized norms that he's interested in. Now, you can easily translate this to a case of health. So you'll often hear that healthy adults ought to have a blood pressure of 120/80. And the the value of the naturalized norms, the reason why it's good to have an account like this is because rather than focusing on a subjective value or a social value or a cultural value, you're focusing on something that's supposed to be a prudential good for the individual and something which is agreed on, right? So it's not the case that we're supposed to have a particular blood pressure because I say so, or because, you know, it's culturally sexy or something like that, but because it's essential to avoiding stroke, right? So we agree that we want to avoid strokes, and having a blood pressure which is higher or lower than 120/80 selects against avoiding stroke. Therefore, we can say things like, you know, you ought to have a certain blood pressure. As Railton puts it, thus emerges the possibility, of saying that facts exist about what individuals have reason to do. So you might already have picked out something sort of odd in this example. And the way that I like to sort of pinpoint it is by saying there's an implicit individualism here in Railton's account. Remember, I said there are sort of three things that natural norm arises out of: two sets of descriptive facts, and then the fixed goal. And Railton seems to just assume that it's the roof that has to be adjusted to meet our expectations, where our expectations are that the roof stands up. Why is that? Well, you know, it might be just that it's practical, right? So we more or less know how to change the designs of our roofs. We don't know how to change the physical facts about snow. You might even say that it's like physically impossible. I can't do anything about the density of snow or the chemical properties of the water, right? And that's what gives me, quote, the more or less definite answers to the question of how to meet it. But I think that the practical concern is sort of a weak one here, right? I mean, imagine you have two camps arguing against each other, right? You have the snow supporters and the roof supporters or something like that. And the snow supporters say, hey, the snow is fine. There's nothing wrong with the snow. It's the roof that should change to meet these conditions. And the roof supporters say the opposite thing. It's the roof is fine. The snow needs to be lighter. If the snow were lighter, there would be no problem here. The roof would stay up and it could have the rafters that it has. Of course, this is kind of silly, a silly way of putting it, because, we don't have people who are, emotionally invested in the physical properties of snow in this way, but that's not true in the case of health. So let's take it outside of that architecture case and abstract it, really. Let's say that there's a peg and a hole, and we want them to fit together, right? So the fixed goal in this case is that these two entities go together, and we agree, we recognize as a problem that they don't fit. Now you have these two camps. One says, look, what should happen here is that the peg should change shape to fit the hole, and the other camp says, what should happen here is that the hole should change shape to fit the peg. You can sort of see that, neither camp has the conceptual high ground here. Either solution would be one that serves the goal that both camps agree on. And so, who's to say that it's the individualist, or maybe you might say the environmentalist that wins? So let's put those in those if-then explanations more explicitly, right? You have the question, why doesn't the peg fit? And you have two answers. The individualist if-then explanation says something like, well, if it's to fit, the peg must have a different design. And the environmental explanation says, well, if the peg is to fit, then the hole must have a different design. Really what you have going on here, I think, is something like a problem of contextual fit, right? We want the peg to fit the hole, and there are many different ways of going about satisfying that goal. Either the peg or the hole, or maybe both, can change such that we can achieve our goal in a mutually satisfactory way. So my critique of Railton basically is on his second criteria here, the more or less definite answers to the question of how to meet particular goals. I think without sort of really realizing it, Railton has focused on the individual as the place, the locus of change, the place that we should sort of intervene on or affect change in order to meet the goal that we want, right? So 2 is true in the snow and roofs case, but at most, what you've got going on here is a disjunction, right? So if we want the roof to stand up, then either fill in the blank, the rafters should be thicker, or, if you have magic powers, you can change the chemical properties of snow, or you can do something like build a giant fan to blow the snow away from the roof, and so on and so forth, right? So in as much as you have a naturalized norm emerging here, it's actually this really long disjunction that contains the various ways to meet the goal, given what we know about those descriptive facts about the individual and the environment that it's in. Okay, so let's focus on health and well-being in particular. And what I want to do now is sort of show how I think reliance on naturalized norms of the kind that Railton was interested in has been imported into our ways of thinking about mental health and disease, and how that might have been generating some problems. So the authors that I've picked out here, on the left, we have Dominic Murphy, who's a philosopher of psychiatry in Australia. I've picked him out because he actually explicitly refers to Railton's account in his 2006 book, Psychiatry and the Scientific Image. And then I have also the 2 big names, Christopher Borse, Jerome Wakefield here. They're very much interested in psychiatric phenomena as well, although the accounts that they give are about health more broadly. Much of what they say, I think, is supposed to apply to mental health in particular. And these are two accounts which I think are often taken to be opposed to each other, or not quite at opposite ends of a spectrum, but like you can either be Borsian or have like a harmless function view, but not both, something like that. But I actually think that they're making the same mistake here. So I'll start real quick with Murphy's view. So in his book, Murphy says that psychiatry is the study of, quote, failures of normal human nature. So he's very much interested in, again, this project of using our empirical sciences to make descriptive claims, that is, true generalizations about the way the mind works, and use those generalizations to sort of shine a light on where things are going well or going poorly. You might note here that in the direct quote that I've taken, failures of normal human nature, this sort of applies to physical medicine as well. And the way that he sort of narrows it is by, just there being an implicit cognitive here. Although he isn't very much concerned about where the line is between psychiatry and the rest of medicine is, if there is one. The way his account works goes something like this. So you start with an exemplar. So we have little Calvin here, who's having trouble paying attention in school. He has poor grades. He's very disruptive in the classroom, something like that. And then what we do is we employ the powerful arm of cognitive neuroscience to sort of find the causal etiology of these symptoms, right? Hopefully, we can trace them to an underlying structure, which is their cause, right? Then, if that underlying structure, so in this case, maybe the mechanisms that the brain uses for managing attention is shared, so it's something that all humans have or use. If it's mechanistically tractable, which is just to say, if we can draw a neat generalization about how the way it works for most humans, and if in Calvin it's functioning abnormally, we can build a model of this thing, and that model will enter our taxonomy of breakdowns. So here's a case of ADHD. It's one way in which things can go wrong. So you can see this account relies heavily on that notion of cognitive mechanism. And he says basically what we want to do here is come up with naturalized norms of the style that Railton is interested in about those cognitive mechanisms. So we'll be able to say something like, well, if in most humans our mechanisms of attention play X role, they allow us to, focus on our schoolwork for an appropriate amount of time, then we can conclude that it must have certain properties. Just the way that the roof had to have certain properties in order to hold up the snow, our mechanism of attention should have certain properties in order to do the things that we wish to do. Or to take the easier example that I had earlier, right? If you want to avoid stroke, right, you ought to have a blood pressure of 120/80, because this is the way of being that selects for avoiding stroke. Shifting focus to the accounts of Borse and Wakefield, they too are interested in these sort of generalizations that we can make about various systems in our body. So this is the disease as dysfunction sort of model. You can divide the body into various systems which are supposed to serve us in various ways. The digestive system is supposed to gather nutrients. The nervous system is supposed to sense various things and allow us to move, and so on and so forth. And the way Borse sets up his account is by saying, look, there wouldn't be a point to textbooks of human physiology if there weren't some, highly uniform structure and function here. And this is why you can learn something interesting by looking at these manuals, right? This is the species design, as he likes to call it. And health then is defined with reference to that. It's conformity to species design. The different functional systems of the species are goal-directed in this way. They are causal contributors to survival and reproduction on his account. So the goal here that he takes to be contextually fixed is the survival and reproduction of the species, and the facts about the various systems of our body should, in the cases where we're healthy, help us maintain that. So then he says, you know, when a function is recognized by biology, a failure of it, even a local one, seems to count in medicine as a disease. Now, where the precise line is, he's not so interested in. He says it's usually this academic, but most diseases involve functional deficits that are unusual by any reasonable standard. And this is just to make reference to, again, you know, very few people disagree that having a stroke is bad, right? And we're supposed to be able to find those standards in other domains of medicine as well. A note on his terminology here, again, because I want to be clear about when we're making descriptive and evaluative claims. When Bohr says disease here, he is meaning to be entirely descriptive. So to say that somebody has heart disease is not to say that it's undesirable, that it requires special treatment, that there's anything that the individual ought to do. This is just pointing out, hey, there's something descriptively interesting about this person. And then he has a thicker sort of layer of terminology, which he uses the word illness for. An illness for Bohr is disease which is serious enough to be incapacitating, right? So we have these sort of two layers, one which is supposed to be thinly normative because it relies on those naturalized norms, that's disease, and one that's supposed to be thickly normative where we introduce some other broader human values. So here are some examples of things that might go wrong. Which of these are diseases for Bohr? Well, they would all be diseases. Whether you're talking about, again, the narrowing of the artery in heart disease, a cancerous cell, a degenerative condition like MS, something that we might classify more in the realm of disability, like congenital blindness or deafness. These would all be diseases for Bohr. However, they would not necessarily all be illnesses. Things like heart disease, cancer, these are more likely to be, whereas it's an open question whether or not deafness or blindness, for example, change people's lives in the right way to classify them as illnesses. Now, Wakefield, on the other hand, we've, at the beginning of the semester, investigated his harm dysfunction analysis. And in his own words, right, dysfunction is a purely factual and scientific concept. A natural function of an organ or other mechanism is an effect of the organ or mechanism that enters into the explanation of the existence, structure, or activity of the organism or mechanism. So, two important things to point out here. Again, we seem to have a sort of evolutionary account of where the fixed goals are. For Bohr, it was survival and reproduction, whereas for Wakefield, it seems to be more about the causal contribution of the particular system within the body as a whole. So how my circulatory system contributes to my living well and healthy. And the second thing to point out is that, again, there's sort of a language game going on here where we have the term dysfunction applying to that thinly normative concept, the one that draws on natural or criterial norms. And then he also has the thicker concept, the way that Bohr does. He'll say, when you have a harmful dysfunction, that's when you have a disease. However, dysfunction itself is it's interesting. It's a failure of some mechanism to perform a function for which it was biologically designed, right? And that's how we're going to be able to categorize and catalog, taxonomize various failures in health generally and in mental health more specifically. So we have these two concepts of health that are taken to be competitors, and they both rely on naturalized norms in order to delineate this class of the healthy ways of being. They use different terminology for it, which is important to point out. We have the term disease for Bohr and the term dysfunction for Wakefield are maybe similar here. But because they both rely on naturalized norms in the same way, I think the implicit individualism that sort of haunted Railton's account in the Snow and Rue's case haunts us here as well, right? If my analysis is correct, then something that's going wrong is that there are unjustified restrictions on what ought to be done in the pursuit of health, because that sort of long disjunction has been narrowed to individualist solutions or interventions. Claims like, you know, the circulatory system ought to be different, or your mechanism of attention ought to be different because we have this goal that we intend to satisfy. And I think that's not true. What you have is a bunch of, you know, equally valuable solutions for a particular goal. And then you have to actually do something extra to say that your particular solution is the one that should be pursued in this case. Some of what I'm saying here is not entirely new. So a lot of people working in disability literature have made critiques about sorting you know, human variation into normal and abnormal. So examples here are, you know, Ron Adamson, Anita Silvers, and then on the right here I have Joe Stramondo and Stephen Campbell. These philosophers have argued that, you know, there's no reason to think that features which are specified descriptively, like paralysis, autism, high blood pressure, are an apt guide to what is disvalued from a perspective of health or well-being. Which is to say something like, you know, looking for dysfunctions doesn't necessarily tell you what you're going to be able to do in the next step of your hybrid account when you need to move to that thicker normative notion. For Borst, this is disease, and for Wakefield, this is, I got it backwards. For Borst, this is illness, and for Wakefield, this is disease. But I think that there's something stronger to say here, which is that, you know, that very search for the supposedly thinly normative dysfunctions might not have been a helpful guide in the first place. So take, for example, more or less contemporary change within psychiatric medicine. We had actually this very debate in taking homosexuality out of the DSM. You had, so one question, you know, was, is there harm going on that's implicit in the individual? And, you know, that answer is very likely no, although that's not to say that there's no harm going on at all, because of course, you know, people who identify as LGBTQ would have had, you know, pressures from family and systems of marginalization and threats of violence. Those are legitimate harms, right? And part of the debate that moved homosexuality out of the DSM was to say, like, look, it's nothing, there's nothing that should be done from the perspective of changing the individual to fix this problem. It's our values that need to change. When you put this sort of analysis to contemporary examples, you can see the tension as well. So there's a really interesting, I'm sad I didn't put this in my slides, but an interesting CDC graphic about the incidence rates of ADHD in the United States. So basically like a temperature map from west to east of ADHD, where in California you have very low rates and then basically a smooth gradient all the way to the East Coast, right? And you might think, well, gee, that's sort of revealing. We might recognize a problem here. We might agree that Calvin's inability to pay attention here is something that needs to be addressed. But how we do that seems to be a matter not just of the way that the kids are, but the way that the school systems are as well, and the difference in various school systems, or maybe cultures of, you know, how long should a kid sit down and pay attention in class is what reveals that. You can say this about Allie too, right? So even a disorder which we take to be fairly unproblematic, like major depressive disorder, has contextual roots. It's not just facts about Allie's inner brain biology that contribute to her feeling melancholy and unmotivated. There are contextual factors as well. It might be, the expectation that she needs to be the best sort of working mom that she possibly can be, or something like that, that's contributing to her feeling unwell. And if our social values changed, that would address the goal just as much as an intervention like a pharmaceutical or deep brain stimulation or something like that. So just to sort of wrap this up, I want to say that I share Railton's intuition in general. I think it is our own human goals, desires, values. These things ground the normative in the natural world. And so, I'm in agreement with theorists who look at naturalized norms in order to figure out how we should understand concepts like well-being, flourishing, and these other things in the good life. It's just that, what morals we can draw from this is much less clear to me. I don't think that, making claims like Calvin's brain should be different in order to manage attention, or, Allie should take this particular drug or take this particular action are justified in the way that other theorists seem to think. At most, they offer themselves up as possible practical solutions, and then we need to take an extra step to justify why the particular intervention that we've come up with is the one that's going to work in this case. And that means that it might be different on a case-by-case basis. So that's to say that, this large disjunction should, I guess, we should pay more attention to it and look for sort of broader solutions in many cases, rather than focusing on those individualist solutions. And I guess the last thing that I'll say too is that third category that I had at the beginning, the sort of the categorical work that we want to do, where we want to have labels that sort of can categorize people like in a diagnostic manual. The fact that these appear to be labels for people rather than for situations is an interesting problem as well. Like, we don't think about capitalism as a disease in the same way that we think about depression as a disease, and that might be like a weird individualist thing as well. And I think, yeah, that's the end. Thanks for your attention. Perfect timing.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Thank you, Natalia, for this wonderful talk. So now we're gonna take your questions. You can, as usual, write that you have a question in the chat, and we will give you the possibility to ask your question to Natalia. The first one always takes a bit of time. Anne-Marie.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. It was a very good talk. I really liked with the square and the square and the circle. It was very clear to me. Like, I think it helps to understand very well. So I like that. So I have a question, but I'm not sure if it affects the general argument, but it was just a clarification. So when you presented like Murphy, Bors, and Wakefield's account, like, I agree with you that like this tendency to ground the norms on or to look for a natural norm is maybe not what we want in psychiatry. But I was wondering if like your criticism about Railton's view could apply directly to their account. And the reason why I was wondering this is that, like, in Murphy, I'm not too familiar, so I will let that aside. But like Bors and Wakefield, from what I understand, the goals that they see for the organism, like a survival, reproduction, the goals are natural, and the ought follows from the naturalness of the goals. And so in what you presented from Railton account, I had the impression that for Railton, like goals are conventional, and the natural norm comes from the ability of ABC to reach the goal, which is conventional. And so I was just, trying to see if the criticism was like directly against Borst and Wakefield's view, and if you have to, I'm not sure if it affects something, but it was just a clarification about this point.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it is. You're right in the roof example. It's very much a matter of convention. Like, there's nothing like moral about having roofs that stay up. It's just, we want them to, and that seems to be that. Whereas in the case of something like health, we see that much less as convention because, because prudential good is something, closer to our hearts. It's something that we think that we should promote for ourselves and for others, and things like that. However, you take a particular goal like survival and reproduction, and then you ask, what are the ways that we can meet this? You still have the same sort of wide disjunction of ways of meeting that particular goal, right? So to narrow it down a little bit, let's say we're interested in attention, and it's not because of school systems, but it's because we want to make sure that we're not eaten by predators or something like that. And that's how these mechanisms of attention evolved. From a theoretical perspective, there's many different ways of meeting that goal, the goal being not being eaten by the lion. Our evolutionary history settled on a particular way of doing things, but you can imagine that other designs emerged. In fact, they did for other animals. Or, you can imagine sort of silly, fantastical sort of examples where, rather than really paying attention, you have like a radio alert system that you built that just, screams lion every time there's a lion in the area, and then you don't have to really worry about it or something like that. That all of these are on a par with each other in terms of like, which is the valid solution to survival and reproduction here, right? Now, one of them is more practical because it seems to be the one that is, we actually evolved or something like that, but that doesn't mean that it's the only way of doing things. And my sort of emphasis, my point here is that we should take more care to see when we're sort of directing people to be a certain way because it's practical rather than because it's the only way of promoting the good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is from Hannah Orion.
Hi there. Thank you, Natalia, for an awesome talk. It was really interesting. I just have a question. It's a clarificatory question. When we're kind of focusing on this broader disjunction about what we can do, I'm wondering if that's kind of like having a broader conception of like the causal contribution that Borst talks about. I was not sure what you might think about that. And sorry if you have already said this and I missed it. But
no, I think you're right. And then that sort of broader perspective, I think, is going to take us away from focus on different ways that the individual can be and towards different ways that the environment can be in order to fix this, contextually salient goal. One thing that's worth mentioning here, I give talks to interdisciplinary audiences all the time, and the reason why they're very hard, one of the reasons why they're very hard, is because it's hard to speak meaningfully to both audiences sometimes at the same time. So either I'll give talks which are very interesting for philosophers, but clinicians are like, but this is obvious and it's what we already do, and why is it worth me saying? Or talks which philosophers find, conceptually boring, but address maybe some problem closer to the ground. And the critique that I'm giving of the philosophical accounts here, I think part of the reason why this is coming up is, because some of the work that the philosophers are intending to do is categorical and definitional in nature. They want an account of mental disorders that is going to track all and only, right, the things which are diseases, and not pick out things like homosexuality or other things that we think don't belong in that category. And the way that they're trying to do that is by looking at these, true generalizations about, the shape of human nature, rather than thinking about how we can solve particular goals in order to build that taxonomy. I think, for many philosophers, that's a backwards way of doing things, because we think what we want to do when we're taxonomizing is like carving nature at its joints. Just the way that we get the chemical elements, we should get the right set of mental disorders.
Okay, next question from Dieneke H.
Sorry, I had my mute on and now things go a bit wrong with camera. Now, thank you for your presentation. I just have a clarification question. It's basically, when you look at your example, say for depression, for which there are various causes and various treatments, and maybe even no treatment at all, and should be the environment, and the same with ADHD. But say, is there also not the situation that, say, if somebody has cancer and there's only one available treatment and otherwise people die, so is it a bit like, is your model, can it be applied to every situation? Is your model not only suitable for situations where basically there is a lot of empirical evidence that the environmental influences are useful or therapeutic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you're certainly right that, the way this problem became salient to me is because I was interested in these cases of psychiatric kinds where the contribution of the environment appears to be a lot stronger than for other kinds of diseases that we might think of. That said, I think what's going on in cases like cancer, the same critique applies. However, we have easy practical arguments to rely on. This is the one and only solution that we know that works, and therefore it's the solution that we're going to employ. And that what needs to be done in those cases is just sort of like a conceptual reorientation in the mind of the person. It's not that the solution that we're using is the practical one, and not, it doesn't mean anything about like the value of your internal makeup or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, to some extent.
And we had a comment from Julio Osores.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. That was a great talk. I just had a comment about how well these ideas apply, as a clinician, basically only an amateur philosopher. But it's so clear when it comes to ADHD, especially with high functioning young adults that I often would see in my practice when the question of ADHD comes up. And you were saying, why would somebody come to a clinician? Are they seeking normative questions? And so you always have to deal with the question: am I abnormal? Do I have a disease? Mm-hmm. And I found myself often saying, kind of something similar to what you're saying, that we really don't know whether, is the problem with the peg or is the problem with the hole? That the educational environments that you are in are maybe there's something very peculiar and not normal about these educational environments. So anyway, so that kind of thinking already creeps in, at least it was creeping in with me, in those conditions in which the question of is this normal or not is really very hard to establish, because the suffering, the disease or the suffering comes up only in a very peculiar situation. So anyway, so that's is the peg and hole analogy is very useful.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad it's useful. Good. I mean, ultimately, sort of what I want to do, not just for maybe in service of clinicians and against philosophers who think the world is neater than it is to say, is to motivate pluralism, really, about psychiatric kinds, that we're going to have cases, some cases which are legitimate diagnoses more because of the intervention we can take on behalf of the individual, some which are more because we recognize that there's a problem despite not knowing what to do about it, some because what's happening here is interesting for a researcher despite not really being a problem for the individual who has that condition. That allowing all of these sort of bases for diagnoses and also being explicit and thoughtful about why different diagnoses are in a manual like this is going to not just improve people's lives, but improve the way that we do research.
Thank you. We still have time for other questions. I had one myself that might not be very clear because I'm thinking of it while you're talking and answering the questions. But in this distinction between individualism versus environmental, I think that was your word. I was wondering if you were more referring to environmental as like, so is this distinction meaning biological versus social, like, or more, and so that would be about the what's going on, the pathology, the dysfunction, or the condition, or are we more talking about the harm, where the harm comes from, and if the harm comes from the dysfunction itself or the systemic marginalization that you are also referring to? And I have the impression that, I mean, these two distinctions are different, but they are also overlapping a little bit. But yeah. There is maybe a difference there because if we're talking about the harm or the what's going on for the person living in that situation, maybe there is a point about insisting on the fact that what is social, systemic, is still real in a way. I don't know if that makes sense. So yeah, I was wondering if you could clarify a little bit this distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to look at the disability literature here, mm-hmm. And maybe in physical disability in particular, because it's been talked about most. But the common refrain here is that the harm that I suffer from my condition, let's say it's relying on a wheelchair, stems not from the shape that my body is, but from society's just total disinterest in accommodating the way that my body is. And that if access were not an issue, there would be no disability at all, right? If I were able to get from point A to point B easily, and the sidewalks were set up in the correct way, and I had the other accommodations I needed, the harm would go away, which is a way of saying that the harm is located in the societal norms rather than the individual. And I take that to be an example of an environmentalist sort of explanation. I don't think, though, that either camp necessarily has the high ground here. If we focus on what both parties agree on, it's that, you know, the current situation is not good. There is a harm taking place. And then they disagree on about the correct way to address that harm. The one says fix the individual, the other says fix the environment. And what I think is that the right answer actually doesn't have anything to do with properly locating the harm, because the harm is just in the contextual mismatch. And so we should rely on other values in deciding what the right quote unquote solution should be. It's not going to be, there's no facts of the matter in the norm. It's going to be an ethical concern that we have, for instance, that, you know, we believe that society should be such that these individuals are taken into account, or, you know, maybe there's a practical concern, like in the case of a physical disease where we really only have one particular solution. This is the only way we know how. We wish it were otherwise, but we know that this is going to address your suffering or something like that. And so what we want to do is think about what those other justifications are and make sure that they're valid.
Thank you. Yeah, that clarifies a lot. Thanks. Are there other questions or comments? All right. If not, I think we can all thank Natalia Washington for a very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Natalia. And we also really want to thank you all for attending this webinar and for your participation that has been very active. So we are thinking of maybe doing another round of webinar next session, and we don't know yet how and when, but stay tuned and we'll let you know if that's happening. So if in the meantime you have comments and suggestions for us, we'll be happy to read your comments by emails. The talks are going to be on the website. I mean, there are most of them on the website already, so you can rewatch the talks of this session. And we really wish you a happy summer, and we hope to see you again soon in this context or another. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Hop, ça va?
Oui, et je pense que tu enregistres encore, hein?
Que quoi?
Est-ce que tu enregistres encore?
Oui.